Hey everyone, Brian Brodersen here, and I want to take a minute and tell you about our upcoming season of Things That Matter. This will be our 5th season. We're going to be looking at pastoral ministry. So I'm going to be joined by a couple of friends, John Wang and Richard Semino, and we're going to just talk about all things pastoral. So we look forward to that. But before we get into our regular season, a while back I had a great conversation with my friend Ed Stetzer. And so today we want you to listen in and watch that conversation that we had. So we're talking about Christians in an age of outrage. That's the title of a book that Ed wrote, and a few other things. So I think you're going to enjoy it. So great to have you with us for this new season, and God bless. Hi, and welcome to this episode of Things That Matter. I'm your host, Brian Brodersen, and it is great to be with you today. And I'm really excited to have my friend, Dr. Ed Stetzer, in the studio today. Ed, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here. Good to be at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa.
Yes, it's great to have you. And we're going to talk about a number of things. Ed, he does so many different things. It's hard for me to even know exactly how to introduce him, but he is a director of the Billy Graham Center in Wheaton.
True.
He holds the chair of
something. The Billy Graham chair.
The Billy Graham chair.
Right. Which I've actually never seen the chair.
Okay.
I think it's more of an idea than an actual piece of furniture.
At Wheaton College.
At Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois.
You are the author of several books, which we're going to focus on one of those books today. And you're the interim pastor of the historic Moody Church in Chicago.
Which is actually how they say it. They say we go to the historic Moody Church.
Is that right?
That's true.
Historic. So I got that down.
That is true.
And you are so many other things, but I am really happy to have you here today.
Well, I'm happy to be here with you, my friend.
So I do want to talk about your most recent book. I believe it's your most recent book.
It
you
is
write
indeed.
books so fast, it's hard to
I have a Book of the Month club.
Keep up with you. But Christians in the Age of Outrage, but we'll get to that. But let's talk a little bit about your role as the director of the Billy Graham Center. What does it mean to be the Billy Graham Chair? Let's talk a little bit about that.
So in academia, you have what are called academic chairs, and chairs are typically endowed chairs. So the technical name of what I hold is the Billy Graham Distinguished Chair of Church, Mission, and Evangelism.
Okay.
So it's an endowed chair, and you have to have certain academic qualifications to hold it. But basically what it is, it's a chair that's intended to hold forth the vision and the values of Mr. Graham, who brought forth a winsome evangelicalism, a desire to show and share the love of Jesus to a broken and hurting world, simultaneously showing social concern and other things as well. So by holding that chair, I teach. So I'm a professor at I'm actually the dean of the School of Mission, Ministry, and Leadership at Wheaton College. So, and of course, Billy Graham is a graduate. Our most famous graduate by far would be Billy Graham.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to just continue that legacy of the kind of evangelicalism, that's the movement, but also the priority of evangelism that Mr. Graham kind of put before us, and we're trying to uphold at Wheaton.
Yeah. So what is the connection, though, between that and the Billy Graham Center? Are they connected? Or
so the Billy Graham Center is a ministry of Wheaton College.
Okay.
So it's a center within the School of Mission, Ministry, and Leadership. And organizationally it's complex, but there's the museum, which I know you've been through, and invite people to come. We've updated it some with Mr. Graham's passing. There's the archive. So I sit on the 4th floor, just a few feet, literally, from Jim Elliot's journal, that where he's written, "He is no fool," the very famous line. And sometimes we take it out and I share it with people, but it's literally right across the hall. So that's the archives. It's the only archives of American evangelism and really evangelicalism in the world. And so the museum, the archives, and then what I specifically lead is the ministry area. So the Billy Graham Center has the Send Institute, which is for church planting, the Institute for Prison Ministry, which is obviously for correctional ministry, and several others. We have rural institutes. So what we do, there's a glass plaque on the outside of our offices that quotes Mr. Graham at its dedication to be a world hub for training and research and more on evangelism and missions, and that's what we do at Wheaton. And Wheaton itself is kind of the academic hub in a lot of ways of evangelicalism.
Right.
So, and we think we're at a real key time, and what's the movement going to be, and what's it going to value?
Yeah.
So we're trying to hold those values up.
The Billy Graham Center in Wheaton, though, is not so much connected to the family, right? Is the family stuff more the North Carolina?
Okay, yeah, sure. So there's actually several. The BGEA is the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. So Franklin Graham's president of that, but we have relationship there with it at the Billy Graham Center. But the Billy Graham Center is a organization incorporated in Illinois, things of that sort. And there are just a few places where Billy Graham has allowed his name to be used. The Billy Graham School in Louisville, Kentucky. I was a professor there, actually. That's part of Southern Seminary. There's a Billy Graham Chair at Beeson Divinity School at Samford University. So they're not all organizationally connected. There's sometimes fraternal connections where trustees or board members will be connected between the two. But it is a different organization, different budget,
Okay.
that kind of thing.
Okay.
But all, the legacy of Mr. Graham
Yep.
is global. I mean, last year
Yeah.
we saw the world pay attention to his passing, and he did a wonderful, this funeral was a wonderful expression of his life. We called it his last crusade.
Yeah.
Millions heard the gospel. Franklin clearly shared the gospel
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, he did
and
a great
millions
job.
heard it.
As you said with Billy, obviously we know that as an evangelist, of
Right,
course,
right,
he had an
right.
amazing influence. But I don't know that all that many people know his influence in, like you said, evangelicalism.
Right.
He was, in some ways, the idea of evangelicalism. He was kind of one of the founding fathers of that in its American expression.
In its modern kind of neo-evangelical expression. So there are, my next book I'm writing on is on the current state and future of evangelicalism.
Yeah.
And so I'm going through reading a lot of scholarly work. And there are real scholars who do point out that one of the things that makes you an evangelical is you like Billy Graham. It sounds strange, but if you think about it, people to the right of him, which would be called fundamentalism, and there are 13,000 fundamentalist churches in the U.S., and that's a real movement with real people, and they generally don't like Billy Graham. They think he works too broadly with other denominations.
Yeah.
People to the left of him often would be some mainline Protestants who think that his message of conversion is unnecessary or simplistic. And so pretty much evangelicalism would hold the message that he shared, that men and women are dead in their trespasses and sins, need the gospel, and are what we call conversionary Protestants, right? So there's that. And so in a sense, I mean, some scholars say he created what is this movement. He and a few others like Carl Henry and Stott and some others. And you can actually make the case. I mean, he co-founds Lausanne, which is the global evangelical missions movement. Gordon Conwell's in trouble. He steps into there. He impacts Fuller Seminary. He impacts. He founds Christianity Today.
Yeah, right.
So many of the institutions, Wheaton College, Billy Graham Center, of evangelicalism, which some would debate whether the institutions make up evangelicalism. He helped to start.
So with Billy and that whole
Just so you know, we call him Mr. Graham. You can call him Billy, but I just want you to know we don't call him
Calvary,
Billy.
we call him Billy.
Do you? Okay. Well, you guys had a closer friendship.
I'm going to go one better with Dr. Graham.
Yes. He actually preferred to be called Mr. Graham.
Did he? Yeah.
Largely because he had honorary doctorates, and he thought it was better to be Mr. Graham. But it's fine, Dr. Graham, Billy, whatever you want to call him.
Yeah.
You're Brian Brodersen. You get to decide.
Okay. So with Billy Graham, and you mentioned he's the founder of Christianity Today.
Yeah.
And he was the one, I think, who actually put Carl Henry in, or him and a few others, as the editor of Christianity Today, I think.
There was definitely a connection. He was early on, yeah.
Connection, yeah. They were, in a sense, pushing back against fundamentalism.
Right.
So they looked at fundamentalism and thought, and define that for a second.
So, of course, Billy Graham went to Bob Jones University.
Yes.
And he
very fundamentalist.
left or was asked to leave, or, it really depends on whose story you hear. So I found it too restrictive. So fundamentalism, it's difficult to define, but it is the movement to the right of evangelicalism, often King James Version only, not all of them, but tends to be, the whole doctrine is what we call first or second degree separation.
Yeah.
So first degree separation is I couldn't partner with you because I disagree with you. Second degree is I can't partner with you if you partner with somebody with whom I have disagreements with it. And so, I mean, if you look at it from a negative perspective, people like me would say fundamentalism makes first order issues of everything.
Yeah.
So whereas there are first, second, and third order issues in evangelicalism, fundamentalists would have a different description of that. But I think that probably the first part all would agree. So Carl Henry writes a book called The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, which basically says fundamentalism is kind of has this otherworldly attitude, doesn't care about situations in the world. But it was actually writing about the movement that they were a part of. So neo-evangelicalism really comes out of fundamentalism, because fundamentalism had lost its. I mean, fundamentalism is based on the idea that there are 5 fundamentals that every person watching this, and you and I would agree fundamentally with all 5 of the fundamentals. And some would have a 6th and a 7th. But fundamentalism took on a cultural meaning of cultural withdrawal and often warring against other Christians. You know, there's movements like IFCA, Independent Fundamental Christians of America, has widely been joked about. I fight Christians anywhere. So it's sort of a, so that became a reputation. So they came out of that.
The Fighting Fundies.
Which certainly Graham would be. I mean, again, he went to Bob Jones. But Wheaton wouldn't be. So he went to Bob Jones, left there, then went to Trinity, what's now Trinity College in Florida. It was the Florida Bible Institute. Did an unaccredited Bible degree there, and then went to Wheaton, and sort of that was a transitional journey for him, and became much more an evangelical than a fundamentalist.
And the reason I'm even probing on this is because I think that in some ways, your book that I want to get to, Christians in the Age of Outrage, we're kind of there with some of those same kinds of issues again. And I think one of the things that I took away from your book was, again, to use just this word, because I think it is a good word that describes what we're talking about here, is a winsomeness. There are Christians in the culture that have lost that.
Agreed.
And so just because of demeanor and attitude, there's already a turnoff by people because they just assume that as a Christian, you're basically against everything and you're super angry about everything, and you're more of a culture warrior. You're more concerned about politics and things like that than you appear to be about the gospel. So
I think that's a fair, and I do think people are asking the question, and I get asked all the time, is evangelicalism savable? Is evangelicalism losing?
And let's talk about that for a second, because so they are reacting. Billy Graham and Carl Henry and others, they're reacting to the fundamentalism of their day.
Right.
So now we have people today saying, is it even valid to even use evangelicalism as a term anymore?
Right. It's been so politicized.
So nowadays a lot of people think that, an evangelical, the statistic that 80% of evangelicals voted for Trump. And then you've got like references to white evangelicalism.
And that
all
stat
of this
that
stuff.
81% is white evangelicals, so no question.
Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, we're kind of, in some ways, we're sort of back at that crossroad.
And I think people are asking, could we just be a gospel Christian? Or in the African American context, it's sometimes it's called a Bible believing Christian, something like that. The challenge is, and I'm actually of the view that evangelicalism as a movement can and should reform itself. I think that it can and should address the fact that there are some people who are maybe speaking for it in ways that are not helpful to it, that are burning bridges with people who don't know Christ when we could be building bridges. And the challenge is, we didn't bring this cultural shift upon ourselves. The cultural shift came, and there are things where you got to say, I believe in certain things that are now out of the mainstream. So that's going to make you seem intolerant or bigoted if you, for example, don't line up with the current views on tolerance or whatever else it may be, because you have a more narrow view. Not on issues of race, because actually evangelicalism is a diverse movement. 1 out of 3 evangelicals is actually evangelical. Is actually a person of color. But what happens is that they're asking the question: is there a better path? I'm of the view that, and that's what Christians in the Age of Outrage is attempting to do, is to say it's easy to get caught up. And it's actually attractive to us. Glenn Beck actually interviewed me on his radio program, and I didn't see that coming. I'm like, okay. Well, he's got a brand new book called Addicted to Outrage. Right? And if there's ever a guy who was the outrage machine, who says, and so we had this conversation, I'm like, okay, I'll talk to you. And he's kind of saying that he talks about how he was addicted to the outrage and how it ultimately was eating him up inside. Well, I would say there's a lot of Christians who have been riled up, sometimes by Christian radio, into thinking that those are the enemies. We got to go to war with them. The challenge is, Brian, you know this, you can't go to war with a people and reach a people at the same time. Yeah. And I think ultimately that's what we got to decide. Are we at war, or can we find ways to be on mission? And I want to be on mission.
Yeah.
Now, I recognize there are times I'm going to have to stand for religious liberty, and I've got plenty of track record and plenty of writing to say that I have it in places that most Christians never get the opportunity to. In the New York Times, front page of the New York Times, I've been quoted on some of these religious liberty issues.
Yeah.
At the same time, I'm a missiologist. I think we need to get on mission. It seems that a lot of Christians have been discipled by their cable news and have been spiritually shaped by their social media, and that's not getting them on mission.
Yeah, yeah. So let's go right to the book now. So the age of outrage. Yeah. Just define that. What do you mean?
Well,
by the age
it's
of
sort
outrage?
of interesting how it's happened. So now we're not in the most divided time. People say, I've heard people say this is the most divided our nation has ever been. They may not have a history book because there was this thing called the Civil War, which was more divided than now, and other eras as well.
Yeah.
But in my lifetime, and I would say in the lifetime most of people watching, this is the most divided the U.S. has ever been.
Yeah.
And it's
politically, I think for sure.
No question. And there's actually studies that show that. Pew does this great study where they show what the median Democrat, the median Republican is, and how that's just moved further and further apart. So I think the age of outrage has also been accelerated and amplified by social media. So I just got an email from a Christian university. They want to do a whole symposium on the ethics of social media. Well, full disclosure, until I wrote this book, I never preached a sermon on social media.
Yeah.
But this is now a huge part of people's lives.
And you got at least a chapter in the book.
I do. And I've got a sermon on it now because it's a huge part of people's lives, and it amplifies the division.
Yeah.
And Christians find themselves, I'm going to take this shot at these people, and I'm going to lay it out, put this comment in, I'm going to teach them. And it ends up, what happens is it gets us into an echo chamber, and that echo chamber gets amplified. People turn the volume up to 11, and soon you can say Brian, I've seen some Christians put some things on social media that I'm stunned. Really, conspiracy theories and horrible things about people they disagree with. Because when you get in an echo chamber that's amplified, like social media, you'll just believe the worst things. And it's hard to read. And because what happens is, we have a picnic in our neighborhood, and we meet our neighbor, and then they follow us on Facebook, because that's how we get each other, we're neighbors. And then they see the things you're saying. It just burns bridges where we ought to be building them. And say, Ed, does that mean we can't say things? I'm American. Can I say whatever I want? Well, you can, but you're a Christian, and that's a higher authority, and that's a higher responsibility. You can say whatever brings glory to God and ultimately accomplishes His mission. And when you put your social media under the lordship of Jesus, I can tell you it looks a whole lot different than some of the Christians I see on social media today.
Yeah, and some of the things that I've been shocked by, some of the things that Christians on social media say about other Christians.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously they would say other things about non-Christians.
Right.
But man, some of the stuff that, sometimes I wonder, like, wow, who ever thought that as a Christian you had a right to say something like that about another
And you
believer,
see it and you think, that's so terrible, that surely can't be a Christian. And you click on the bio and it's, follower of Jesus, disciple, whatever else is after that. So I think that people say, well, I'm just being frank. I just got to be frank. Listen, if your name's not Frank, you don't got to be frank. And if your name's Frank and you're a follower of Jesus, you still need to be Christ-like. And I think that, you caught onto the word winsome. That's a key theme. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think Billy Graham exemplified, is a winsome ambassador. And that's key. We're here to represent Jesus and His kingdom. And so even on politics, I'm not anti-politics. I write on things, right? I write in secular publications. I'm quoted. The difference is that I'm not all in on any political or elected figure. I'm only all in on Jesus. So if I can't, for example, critique and say, boy, what that person said is really terrible, I don't want to be associated with that, I got to always be all in, I'm ultimately doing it wrong. Jesus is not coming back on Air Force One. And when He does come back, He's not riding on a donkey or an elephant. And so I ought to make sure my loyalties are very clear so everybody might see them. Yeah,
and it's interesting. And I lived outside the country for some years, and it is amazing. And obviously every place has its own politics and things like that. And I'm talking about really kind of the connection between the Christian faith and a political view or a political party. That's kind of unique in a sense to American culture, because when I lived in Britain, for example, whether you were part of the Labor Party or you're part of the Conservatives or the Tory Party, I mean, that just...
It is very different here. And it does create challenges because what it means is, because presidential elections are always decided by a handful of percentages. So what that means is half the people who are your neighbors disagree with you on politics. And if you cloak that completely in your Christian faith, what you're basically saying is you can't be a Christian unless you agree with me on these political aims. And you're right. It is. I mean, it's uniquely American. There are some. The Brazilian election recently has some things that sort of resemble some of that. But I would say, and it's important to note that I think for all of us, particularly those watching in the U.S., one of the things that's happened is a lot of the concerns that evangelicals have migrated them to the Republican Party, particularly white evangelicals, issues of abortion, issues of marriage, issues of that sort. And I totally understand that, and I'm not here to say you should or shouldn't do that, but I am here to say we need to be careful when Christian means this political persuasion. It makes it real hard to reach people who are not Christian. And Tim Keller had a great article recently, how do Christians fit in a two-party system? And the answer is they don't.
They don't, right?
Now, again, my voting patterns would reflect, I think, most evangelicals. But what I would say is, if I fit completely, then Jesus is not fully Lord. Because ultimately, nobody should fit completely in the systems of the world.
And I mean, obviously, there are certain, seemingly political issues that are really more spiritual and moral, and even biblically, to be true to Scripture, you would have to take a position a certain way, right? But then there are other things that just get thrown in there. And I think immigration is a good example to me, because it's like, there's no biblical teaching on immigration, and the message you gave where you're talking about, borders and nations and all of that stuff. And I understand all of that. I live in that context, but this is a relatively new development in world history.
And I think Christians can rightfully debate levels of immigration, whatever it may be. And I think there are scripture passages in the Old Testament that relate to welcoming the stranger that are individual, sometimes national. And I think I think you could have I think the challenge is when we start demonizing people, like these people who are, they're trying to, and we make up things about them. The reality is, and again, my immigration views, and I have immigration views I've written on them, they look more like George Bush than George Soros. But that's what happens. Whatever you say, I think maybe we should have a pathway to this or that. Oh, you're like, George Soros. I never met George Soros, don't know George Soros. I think kind of like George W. Bush on immigration. And I apologize for mentioning a political figure. But the point is, it's become such a radicalized debate now. So I think debating, here's the refugee numbers, here's the immigration numbers. I think that's good. I think it's right to do that, and countries have borders now, and they have border controls now. And I think, I don't think it's funny, because President Trump is very known for this. President Obama said things about the border, and President Clinton, you want to talk about, or Hillary Clinton, have said things about the need to secure the southern border. I think the difference is that when I hear politicians talk about that these people are some sort of threat, when statistically, if you want an illegal immigrant from Central or South America is more likely to be an evangelical pastor than to be a rapist or a murderer. And yet that's not the argument that you hear. And what I would say is, let's have a discussion about what's best for the nation. I think that's a good discussion to have. You're in Southern California, it's an important discussion, right? But to have that without demonizing people as the other, I think is, these people are made in the image of God, worthy of dignity and respect.
And it is difficult. In the current climate, sometimes it's difficult to even have a conversation, right?
It is. It'll be interesting to see, just even this interview here, because what happens is that phrase I just got about more likely to be an evangelical pastor. Well, wait, but they're sneaking in across the border. Should an evangelical pastor do that? Well, isn't that, there's a whole debate, and I get that there's a debate to be had. But when you pastor, like Moody Church, where I've been serving, we have a significant number of people who are in our Latino, either congregations or our congregation itself or congregations we planted, who are here working jobs that Americans don't want to work, but are not doing so legally. And so how do you respond to that when you're a pastor? Well, all of a sudden it becomes very, very real. It's not some intangible idea. This is very, very real.
And I'm in Southern California, so if you got it in Chicago, we really have it here.
Oh, sure.
And right. So, okay, so let's so this age of outrage, social media has exaggerated all of these things.
Yep.
I do think, because I'm on Twitter as well and all of that, and sometimes I think, man, if I just go a couple days, I'm super busy, I don't get a chance to look at any tweets or anything, I just feel so much more relaxed. It's like, wow,
It's true.
Because a lot of times
true.
I think it's a little bit exaggerated.
It is.
When you're out in the culture, I mean, you'll find some uptight people for sure, and you'll find your culture warriors on both sides for sure. But I think a lot of people are just going about life,
Yeah, Twitter is
to,
not the real world. We had recently a big blow up on Twitter about something we were engaged and involved with, which was a good thing, but it was made into a bad thing on Twitter. I was getting thousands of tweets an hour, negative tweets, whatever. And I got to tell you, nobody outside of Twitter knew there was a controversy. Nobody outside of Twitter knew that there was anything.
Yeah.
So social media. My wife, my wife likes to say that she'll say Ed's kind of a big deal on social media, which is kind of like being the dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons. You're kind of a big deal in a fake world of geeks. She's not a big Twitter fan, so she says, it's not a real world, and she's right. Matter of fact, if you look at her Twitter account, if you go to @Donna Stetzer, it says, "Please don't follow me. I'm only here to follow my husband. He tweets too much," and that's all it says on her Twitter account. Right. But it is not the real world. Now, can people really experience real pain and real struggle? Yeah. And there are times when I've responded pastorally in the midst of that. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I think pastors, most of the viewers of this be pastors and church leaders, they need to be careful. Your ministry is not social media. Yeah. Now, in a sense, mine in some ways is, and because you're a global leader. But for most of us, you don't need to know people on Twitter. You need to know people in your church, and that's more important.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, it's exaggerated on social media, but there is a different atmosphere in the culture today with race and some of these different things. So let's just talk, as we kind of wind things up, let's just talk about, because you had some really great insights, and I ended up, writing out some of the quotes from the book, where you just put so succinctly, basically just the way we ought to be thinking, like you already said earlier, okay, this is a mission field. Yeah. And there's a part in the book where you talk about like an attitude of disgust. Yeah. And man, I'll tell you, that spoke volumes to me, because I thought, so often it's just even in maybe our facial expressions or something like that, and you used it in this kind of an example where you're saying, I love you, but you're also expressing disgust. Yeah. So the disgust overrules the claim to love, So how do we better navigate that?
Yeah, so there's a whole field, which I didn't know until we started researching the book, where disgust is studied. Yeah. And there are scholars in this field. And there's a sense that when we get in a conflicted situation, that we become so disgusted by people on the other side that we don't even see them as people that matter anymore more. And I think that that's sort of what happens. Yeah. And it's one of the reasons why people, I live in Chicago, and the political ads in Chicago are like nothing I've ever experienced before. Yeah. I've lived different places, but man, the Chicago politics is dirty politics, right? Chicago motto is vote early and vote often. But the ads are just, this person is horrible. Their mother's horrible. Their father's horrible. Their aunts. And the level of disgust is just so evident. And people buy into it. Yeah. And what happens is that, let's say the vote's 55 to 45, there's 45% of the people who lost and are now disgusted by the person in office. And I think ultimately disgust leads us to be to a place where we can ignore, where we can not see as person. So I think that if someone's on the other side of an issue, and one of the things that I tried to do in the book is there are about 50 examples of people building a bridge with another side where normally they'd be disgusted, they actually have built a bridge. And the end result is, as from a Christian perspective, it doesn't always mean a person comes to Christ, so there's lots of those examples too. But it enables us to, I think more in the way of Christ, which would be to ask, all right, what's going on? What's hurting inside this person? Why are they afraid of me? You'd be surprised how many people are afraid of evangelicals. Yeah. And so for me, that idea of moving beyond the initial reaction, which really seeks to demonize someone else, rather than saying, they're made in the image of God, and that's a key thing. You remember the Imago Dei is a key thing in there. They're made in the image of God, worthy of dignity and respect, simply because they're made in the image of God. and then seek to start from there, it just changes
Yeah,
everything.
and you know, that whole Imago Dei thing, I mean, it's something that I think has kind of surfaced more recently over the past few years where people are talking more about it. But I think it's an important idea that we have overlooked for a long time. Because if you think of every person, whether you like them or not, if you think of them as an image bearer, it just helps, I think, set the tone for how you're ultimately going to, deal with them, communicate with them, think about them. Sometimes I think, I'll see somebody that's, maybe homeless, maybe, burned out on drugs or whatever, and I'll just have a thought like that was somebody's baby at one time, and that softens my heart. It does. It really does.
Just and partly, I mean, this is why Christianity exploded in its early centuries, because it didn't see people as other, but treated them. You remember in the book, one of my favorite things is talking about Julian the Apostate.
Yeah.
And when he's got the name the Apostate, his mother didn't call him that. So later Christians would call him that. He tried to turn back the tide
back
of
to paganism,
the Christian advance. Exactly. Yeah. So but he didn't do it. And so he was so bothered by it that he spoke of these impious Galileans. The Christians were the Galileans. These impious Galileans. And he talked about how they care not only for their own sick and dead, but for ours also.
Yeah.
And welcome them into their agape, their love community. And ultimately, that's the kind of thing that happened 100 years before that. There was a plague in Cyprian, and in Carthage. And Cyprian was the bishop of Carthage. And he brought all the Christians into the town square and said, we're not going to react like everyone else does. We're going to care for everybody regardless of their beliefs. And he lays all this out. And he did that. And so he treated people as those made in the image of God. And so the plague came, a lot of them died who cared for the sick and the dying. Yeah. But they saw something in the Christians that was different. 100 years later, Julian the Apostate would say, those impious Galileans. Can I just tell you, I think we need to reclaim the moniker impious Galileans who care for people, regardless of who they are, because they're made in the image of God, worthy of dignity and respect.
Yeah, amen. Well, we could go on and on talking about this, but our time is up. So Ed, thanks for coming on the program. Thanks for writing the book. It's a fantastic book, and thanks for joining us today. If you haven't yet read or listened to Christians in the Age of Outrage, I want to encourage you to do it. I've read it personally, and many people that I've talked to have told me how much it has helped them to see things through a bit of a different lens. And so check that book out. And great to be with you, and we'll look forward to being with you in the future. God bless.